About the challenge, infrastructure you mentioned in Honduras, and also language. But I'd like to explain which are the stages that people have to go through when they decide to live overseas.
Sure. Well, it's going to, for somebody who is new to travel, and when I say travel, I'm not talking about touring, being a tourist. Tourists generally go to a place and they're there for a short period of time, and they may have limited interaction with the locals, and they're there usually to see sights or do things or so on. I'm not against tourism at all. Tourism is wonderful, and I highly recommend people do that. But it's different from traveling. When you travel, you're actually interfacing with the country more. You're not there necessarily to get things for yourself. You may be there to do business, or there to explore, or just to get to know the people or whatever. And so tourists rarely are in a place very long. And so they're not going to feel things like culture shock. And we'll talk about that here in a second. But generally, they're going to go into that first stage, which is the honeymoon stage, and they're going to stay there. Everything's new, it's cool, it's different, exciting, the food's good, everything's wonderful. And so they go home and they say, oh, well, the X country is just a wonderful place. And they don't have to deal with transportation issues or strikes or poverty or anything like that. It doesn't even have to be poverty. It can be you can go to a wealthy nation, and you will find that there are, if you stay long enough, some of the things that at first seem to be really great and fun and neat, all of a sudden aren't anymore. And I give this example that in class, Tiago, that culture shock, which is the second phase. Honeymoon is the first phase. The second phase, culture shock. Usually you have to be somewhere a certain amount of time before you experience culture shock. What happens in our own culture is we fly on autopilot. It's like flying an airplane. We switch on the autopilot. We know our culture. We have grown up in it. We've learned how to operate and live in that culture. And so we just cruise along. And it's easy for us. But when we enter into another culture, all of a sudden the rules that govern, that would allow us to be on autopilot, go away. Well, we have to switch off autopilot. So we're flying now. We're manually flying on. Well, that's fun at first too. But if you've ever played a video game that gets progressively more difficult, the further you go in the video game, the more difficult it gets. So what happens is we get tired and we get frustrated. And we have every decision, which at home we're just sort of automatically making, here in another culture we have to think about, well, how do I act? What do I say? What do I do? I don't want to do the wrong thing. And so we go into this period of culture shock. Most people, once they get beyond that, are going to get into a stage of adjustment where they're more comfortable. Now they're somewhere, it's still a nice place. It's still, you love wherever you're at. You still have that honeymoon aspect. But you also have that aspect that's more realistic. That you say, okay, this isn't so great about this culture, but hey, that happens and I can live with that. If you stay long enough in a culture, and sometimes this takes years to occur, but you can actually develop mastery. And mastery just simply means that you're almost able to switch the autopilot back on in that second culture. And so when you're there, you're comfortable. Now, what will happen to people like me who have traveled a lot of different countries and stayed for significant periods of time over time is I find that the culture shock, the honeymoons aren't as high, the culture shock is not as high. I adjust much quicker than I did before, and my expectations are better. It's like I know that I go to a new country, it's going to be exciting, it's going to be fun, but I'm also realistic about that. I know that they've got problems just like my culture does. I just haven't experienced them yet. And so as they occur, okay. Here in Oklahoma City, we don't have a lot of transportation problems, not a lot of traffic jams and things. We've got wide roads, lots of land and so forth. If I were to go visit you in your home, you probably, my guess is you probably have a lot of heavy traffic and so on. Yeah. It could be very frustrating to me. And I'm not used to using a lot of public transportation here in Oklahoma. I would probably use public transportation, so I'd have to learn that. So that's how that goes and can be rather challenging. But people learn, if you go into any other culture with realistic expectations, understanding that there are going to be things that you're going to like, that you're going to not like, but even the ones that you not like, you know, if you'll give it a chance, you may find that there's just an awful lot of wonderful, wonderful ways of living out there, ways of looking at the world that you'll never find in your own culture.
Dom, to wrap this issue up, what's your advice for people who wants to live abroad?
I think probably one of the best things that you can do, and if you have a family, you need to include your family in this process. But one of the best things that you can do is learn as much as you possibly can about the place that you're going to be traveling and visiting. Or you said living, so if you're going to live in a new place, learning everything that you can about that place, about its culture, will help you navigate that culture when you're there. Now, I will tell you that you can read all the books. If I was visiting Brazil, I could read all the books on Brazil, try and understand everything about it and so forth, and yet when I got there, things would be different. Nobody's experience is going to be the same. So even if I read somebody else's experience, it won't be my experience. But it helps. It helps understand what to expect. It helps to understand how to react. The second piece of advice I would have is, if at all possible, at least learn basic the basics of the language. Now, obviously, if you're going for a very short time, that doesn't matter. But if you're going to live somewhere, trying to learn as much as you can in advance, language-wise, is very helpful. Once you get on the ground, once you're there in the other country, enroll in language courses. Do everything that you can to try to get as much of the language as you possibly can. Now, even with that, most people are not going to become what we would call fluent. But if you could just become basically conversant, it makes life so much better for you. The third piece of advice I have, and this to me is probably in many ways the most important, get to know the locals, your neighbors. It's really easy, especially as an American, since English is such a predominant second language. And it's really easy to sort of live in a bubble in another country. That's not true in all countries, but many it is. Okay, you can go as an American. You can go there, and you can live in a bubble. I think this is probably true though for other people. I have my brother is married to Marianne. She's Brazilian. She has a lot of Brazilian friends and family in Cape Cod, where she lives. And it would be very easy for them all to stay together and all speak Portuguese with one another. We have large contingents of Rwandans and Chinese here on this campus. They could all stay together and only do that, and you can live your life that way. But what do you gain from it? Instead, I think probably the most important piece of advice is get out of your shell, go meet people, talk to locals, and just as a personal example, when I lived in Germany, I was assigned in the United States Air Force. My wife Marcia and I decided that we were going to live what we say, our lingo is to live on the economy. So we were going to live in a German village. We weren't going to live on the base, and we wanted to do that so that we would be able to interact more closely with the Germans. One of the first things I did was I joined the local village band. I'm a clarinet player. And so I joined the local village band, and they welcomed me because they needed players. And I played in that band for 3 years. And from that experience, I got to meet so many local Germans. I got to participate in local festivities, in weddings, and in celebrations, Christmas parties, things that most American military people would never get a chance to do. And so that's a decision you have to make. You have to make yourself get outside your bubble, connect with the locals, and that's what I'd really recommend.
Okay, so that's it. We are done for today. I hope that everyone took some piece of advice from this excellent professor and excellent person. Dr. Andrew, thank you so much.
Thank you, Tiago. I appreciate it.
For your time. So, see you next time.